Now I'm going to demonstrate the transition from grasp the sparrow's tail to single whip, and I'm going to pause at the end of each one of the transitions in our core movement. First, we have the sinking back and parallel position of the arms. Then we have the rotation around, pivoting the foot 135 degrees. Then we have the shifting back and formation of the crane's beak. Then we have the movement into empty stance. We have the projection of the crane's beak. Step out onto the heel. Shift forward with the palm facing in, and then pluck to face the palm out. Then we pivot in, opening the palms, shift all of the weight in one movement to the left leg, and then place the heel. Now I'm going to go into the core movements from the final position after a single whip so we can see how the changes in our core actions change the ultimate outcome of the movement. I think that the single whip position is a great place to do this because there are 4 distinct transitions that we're going to see within the 108 form, and you'll be able to compare the movements of the core between each one of those. And I'm going to add 4 additional transitions that we don't see within the form, but those different transitions will help inform your understanding of the core movements. In the Tai Chi Code, what we are doing is correlating each of the 8 energies of Tai Chi with 8 combinations of core movement, because I believe that is what they indicate. We have an element of hip energy, flexion or extension with each movement. We have an element of lower ab rotation, which create the root. And then we have an element of upper ab rotation, which controls the direction and projects the arm energy. When we look at the combinations together of either clockwise or counterclockwise upper waist rotation, clockwise or counterclockwise lower waist rotation, or an element of either left or right hip flexion or left or right hip extension, this gives us 8 specific energies. And my personal opinion is, and the definition of the Tai Chi Code is, correlating those 8 core movement combinations with the 8 energies of Tai Chi. And if you follow me through with these sequences of transition that I'm going to do, I think it will become very obvious that this is correct. We're going to begin in single whip. So in single whip, I have my glutes pushing, which is a yang energy, from my right hip. And I'm turning the upper waist against the right hip, and I'm turning the lower waist away from the right hip. So the waist core movement is all on the left as I extend the right. That is the core movement of pluck. Now, when we transition to raise hands and shoulder strike, what we're going to do is switch the power over to the left hip from the right hip. And in the 8 transitions that I'm going to show you right now, all 8 are going to use the left hip as the power. So we're going to be able to equally compare the power coming from one hip and how it relates to our waist rotation. There are other movements that we can do transitioning that are going to power with the right hip, but I want to keep this very simple. So each one of the movements are all coming off the same hip. So the first one is the transition to raise hands and shoulder strike. I'm going to power by flexing the left hip. This is left hip flexion. And at the same time, I'm going to rotate the upper and lower waist to the right, clockwise. That creates this movement here. And if you do that movement and then check out the position of your upper and lower waist, you'll be able to see that this is the outcome. If I take my upper waist and turn it to the right as much as I can, you'll notice that the movement doesn't really change because it's already doing that action. Now I'm going to take the lower abs and turn it to the right as much as possible. And again, there's no movement because that's already the position we're in. And then now I'm going to try to lift up or flex my left hip, and you'll see that nothing happens because the left hip is already in flexion. So that is the transition. This movement in the Tai Chi Code correlates with elbow strike. We have a yin action of the hip, flexion, and the upper and lower waist turning away from the flexing hip. As we go through the remainder of the 108 form and subsequent videos, you will see that this is always the case. Anytime we are doing elbow strike, the upper and lower waist are turning away from the left hip or the active hip. So that is the transition. Now let's see a similar movement of the waist, but instead of hip flexion, we're going to use hip extension. So I'm going to extend from the glutes of the left. So instead of flexing the left hip like this, I'm going to extend the left hip from the glutes, combining that with rotation clockwise from the upper and lower waist. And that produces this full turnaround. That's the turnaround that we're going to see later when we do Fair Lady Works the Shuttle. But right now we're just focusing in on the turnaround. Upper and lower waist turning to the right as I extend the left hip. That's the core action. It's the same core action that we did coming out in the transition turnaround before single whip. That movement where we turn the upper and lower waist away from the extending hip in the Tai Chi Code is shoulder strike, because what we'll always see is that when we do shoulder strike, we're turning the upper and lower waist away from the extending hip, creating a shoulder strike. You'll see a different transition of shoulder strike in the 108 form coming out of this movement here, where we don't actually do what's a visible shoulder strike. We do a step backward before the transition to crane cools its wings. That step backward is also extension of the hip and upper and lower waist turning away from the extending hip. That makes this a shoulder strike energetically, even though there's no actual strike of the shoulder that we saw here. Upper and lower waist turning away from the extending hip. So turning the upper and lower waist away from the extending hip, we'll see that later on in the transition to Fair Lady Works the Shuttle. Now let's do a variation where we're again going to extend the left hip using the glutes, but instead of turning the upper and lower waist away from the extending hip, we're going to turn the upper waist towards the extending hip, lower waist away. That produces this movement here, which is what we do in the transition to cloud hands. So we have the upper waist turning to the left as the lower waist turns to the right, an extension of the left hip. So from this position, you can also check your core movement. Turn your upper waist to the left, nothing happens. Turn the lower abs to the right, nothing happens. Extend your glutes on the left as much as possible, nothing happens, because that is the position you are already in. And that is pluck. It's the same energy we used here. Same energy we used here. We'll see later in the form, it's the same energy that will create pickup needles at sea bottom. It's the same energy that we'll use creating high pat on horse. Upper waist turning against the extending hip, lower waist turning away from the extending hip. Now let's do another transition that we see within the 108 form, and that's the transition to high pat on horse. We're going to be using the same waist rotation that we just did going to cloud hands. Upper waist turning to the left, lower waist turning to the right. But instead of extension from the left hip, we're going to use flexion of the left hip. Flexion of the hip creates a rotation towards that side, whereas extension from the hip creates a rotational energy away from that side. And so you'll see that in combination with the waist rotation, and it determines our ultimate position at the end of the movement. So when I flex the left hip and turn the upper waist to the left and lower abs to the right, it sinks me back in this position. And then if I turn the upper waist now to the right, it gets me to empty stance. And now I'm prepared to pluck and do high pat on horse. So instead of turning the upper and lower waist to the right all at the same time, first I turn the lower waist to the right, then the upper waist to the right. That gets me into empty stance. So those are 4 transitions we will see within the 108 form. Transition to raise hands and shoulder strike. Transition to Fair Lady works the shuttle. Transition to cloud hands. And transition to high pat on horse. Now I'm going to show some additional transitions that are not seen within the form, but they will inform you of how the core works. So from here, what we're going to do is the upper and lower waist on the left. So same position we have from the upper and lower waist here. Upper waist turning to the right, lower waist turning to the left. I'm going to extend the left hip now. That creates this downward and backward movement and pushing down of the left palm. So my upper waist is going that way, lower abs are going this way, left hip is extending. That is push. We see the same motion when we're doing grasp the sparrow's tail. This is a push down before the push forward. From the end of single whip, that would be the same action. I can just transition from the left hip to the right hip extending and put us back into the single whip position. Left hip extension, right hip extension, core waist movement on the left throughout both of those movements. Now we're going to do a transition that we use all the time when we are standing up with proper posture or when we are walking. I'm going to use the core waist movements on the left still, and what I'm going to do is flex the left hip as I continue this core waist movement, and that is going to cause me to rise or lift the body into a standing position. I have a slight angle here. If I turn the upper waist to the left, it's going to close that standing position off, and I can go assume a normal standing posture. I'll do this one from the front view. This core action, hip flexion, waist rotation on the same side, creates a lifting action, putting us into this position. This is the same action that we take when we are walking. If I was to walk and place a foot and I wanted to stand up, that's the motion that I would do, and it would stand up. If I want to continue walking, what I would do is shift forward and then stand up, and it brings me to this position so I can continue the next step. But that is the core movement. And in the Tai Chi Code, that is the movement of press. In the walking code, I call that technique lift. Now there are two other movements of the core that we can do to round out all 8 energies. And these don't have a practical application, so I'm saving them till the end. And those are ward off and rollback. But doing them will complete our 8 movement sequence. So from the end of single whip, if I extend my left hip and turn the upper and lower waist toward the extending hip, that is going to project my arm out this way. Because all of the energy is projecting off of an extending hip, that creates a ward off action of my right hand. This movement isn't seen within the form, but you can recognize that that is ward off, coming by extending my left hip, turning the lower abs to the left and upper abs to the left, create that projection of the right hand. And instead of extending the hip, if we flex the hip, what we're doing is creating rollback. The difference between rollback and ward off is that we're turning into a flexing hip in rollback, we're turning into an extending hip in ward off. So if I were to do rollback here, it would look like that. So you're going to see the rotation of the arm, not a projection of the arm, the right arm I'm talking about. So all of the movement of the arm is retreating this way as I roll back. Now, if I had my hands in this position to begin and did that, you would see this motion. But from this position, you'll see the rotation. And the rotation we also use when we're walking all the time. If I were to do this off of my right leg, this rotation is what's going on before we take a step, walking in a circle. So those are all 8 of the what I call core techniques, which are the explanation of how the elements of upper, lower waist rotation and hip action correlate with the 8 energies of Tai Chi. This is my own analysis and theory, but I think if you practice feeling these movements, rotation of the waist muscles, flexion or extension from the hip muscles, you will be able to see the truth in this theory as it applies to all 8 movements we can do coming out of single whip. And we will see how it applies to all of the movements in the 108 form as we continue on through this series. Thanks for joining me.